The village of Little Whitcomb was wrapped in an unusual winter hush. Snow had fallen in thick, glistening layers over the week, transforming the familiar lanes and hedgerows into a scene reminiscent of a Christmas card. Icicles hung from the eaves of cottages, their crystalline points catching the weak winter sunlight and scattering tiny rainbows across the frozen garden paths. Yet, despite the serene exterior, a tension rippled through the air that only the keenest observer might notice, a tension that Miss Jane Marple, visiting her dear friend Dolly Bantry for the fortnight, detected immediately. It was on a Wednesday morning that Dolly suggested a small tea gathering in the Summerhouse at the far end of her garden. The snow outside sparkled in the early light, and the Summerhouse, though typically reserved for quiet moments of reflection or solitary embroidery, now promised warmth, steaming tea, and a chance for a few neighbors to exchange idle gossip. Dolly, for all her warmth and charm, had a flair for creating occasions that felt delightfully intimate, while subtly ensuring the most interesting villagers would be present. Miss Marple, with her delicate frame swathed in a grey wool coat, smiled politely as she adjusted the scarf around her neck. "I hope the snow won't trouble anyone," she remarked, her soft voice carrying a hint of concern. Dolly waved away the thought. "Oh, my dear, it's quite manageable. The roads are cleared sufficiently, and a little snow adds charm, doesn't it? I insist on your presence, Jane, and you'll meet Mrs. Penhaligon's nephew, recently returned from London. Quite the dashing fellow, I hear." The small circle of guests trickled in over the next hour. Mrs. Penhaligon, a brittle woman with spectacles perched precariously on her nose, entered first, bustling past the threshold with an overzealous sweep of her muff. She carried a basket of almond biscuits and a carefully folded handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to Miss Marple both habitual and mildly ritualistic. Next came the village doctor, Dr. Harrow, who moved with a deliberate calm that made him seem both authoritative and quietly amused by the social dynamics surrounding him. Mr. Paulstone, the local estate manager, arrived soon after, his presence marked by a subtle stiffness that belied the relaxed smile he offered to the group. And lastly, there was the aforementioned nephew, Geoffrey Penhaligon, whose jaunty London manner immediately set a few heads turning. The gathering began with the usual polite chatter, remarks on the beauty of the snow, comments on the severe cold, and the almost inevitable speculation about next year's garden show. Dolly flitted about, refilling cups of tea and suggesting biscuits with an air of practiced grace. Miss Marple, however, observed quietly from the far corner, noting subtle movements, the slight tremor in Mrs. Penhaligon's hands, the way Dr. Harrow's eyes lingered a fraction too long on Geoffrey, and the tension behind Mr. Paulstone's smile. Each detail was small, seemingly insignificant, but to Miss Marple every mannerism spoke volumes. The conversation shifted naturally to the Summerhouse itself. Built by Dolly's late husband, it was a charming structure. Its wooden frame painted a soft cream, windows catching the winter light at every angle. Inside, the warmth of the small stove mingled with the aroma of fresh tea and biscuits. But as the group settled, a slight, almost imperceptible chill crept along the edges of the room, an odd draught that even Dolly seemed unaware of. "I do hope no one minds," Dolly began, "but I thought a little reading of recent news might amuse us while we drink tea." She produced a neatly folded newspaper and began reading aloud a light-hearted account of social events in the county, the kind that seemed to leave more gaps than information. Miss Marple listened as ever, half to the words, half to the reactions of her neighbors. Subtle shifts in expression, fleeting glances, even the small coughs or abrupt laughter, all were data points in her mental ledger. It was then that a shrill noise, startling in its suddenness, cut across the soft murmur of conversation. The group turned toward the Summerhouse's narrow corridor, a space leading to a small adjoining room used for storage. There, lying on the floor in a pool of crimson that seemed almost surreal against the white carpet, was the lifeless body of Mr. Paulstone. A letter opener protruded grotesquely from his chest. For a moment, none could speak. Mrs. Penhaligon clutched her pearls as if they were talismans against horror. Dr. Harrow stepped forward immediately, his hands professional and steady, checking for signs of life that were tragically absent. Dolly, though composed, placed a trembling hand over her mouth. Geoffrey Penhaligon's eyes darted about, searching for a plausible explanation, yet finding none. Miss Marple, her knitting needles still in hand, studied the scene with a calm that belied the shock around her. Her sharp eyes noted the angle of the letter opener, the absence of a struggle, the faint footprints leading toward the French windows that opened onto the snow-laden garden. Each detail, minor and almost invisible to the untrained eye, was stored in her mind like a puzzle piece waiting for its place. "It must have been quick," Dr. Harrow murmured, his voice low but commanding attention. "There are no defensive wounds. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Mrs. Penhaligon whimpered. "But who could—" Her words dissolved into a small incoherent sob. Geoffrey, regaining some composure, stepped back. "Surely we must call the police. It's a matter for the authorities." "Yes, of course," Dolly said, her voice trembling only slightly. "But perhaps we should not touch anything." "I mean, not until Inspector Cray arrives." Miss Marple nodded in agreement. "Indeed, one must always allow the experts to work. Though," she added softly, almost to herself, "the smallest detail can often tell the largest story." Her eyes, however, were fixed on the footprints fading into the snow outside, a detail unnoticed by anyone else. As they waited for the local constable to arrive, the guests huddled in uneasy clusters, exchanging hushed whispers. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately, some absurd, some instinctively plausible. Everyone had a theory, and each theory seemed to contradict the next. Yet Miss Marple, as ever, listened. Each whispered conjecture, each nervous glance, was a clue in itself, a human reaction revealing hidden fears, desires, and perhaps guilt. The snow continued to fall silently outside, coating the garden in an innocent white, masking the darkness that had intruded into the summerhouse. And within that fragile calm, Miss Marple, seated near the window, observed. Not a muscle of her face betrayed the storm of thoughts running behind her gentle eyes. The villagers were unsettled, frightened, and entirely unaware of the quiet intellect that was already piecing together the story hidden within their own lives. In Little Whitcomb, it would not be long before the village realized that a single murder could unravel years of carefully maintained appearances, and that Miss Marple, in her gentle way, would be the thread connecting the visible scene to the invisible truth. The snow had continued to fall in soft, almost ceremonial silence, blanketing Little Whitcomb with an unnatural stillness that contrasted sharply with the emotional storm brewing within its inhabitants. By the afternoon, the news of Mr. Paulstone's murder had spread beyond Dolly Bantry's garden gates. A village accustomed to minor squabbles and domestic disputes found itself facing an event of alarming gravity. At the Blackbird Inn, the hearth crackled, filling the room with warmth and a subtle scent of peat. The regulars had gathered, their mugs of ale untouched as the story passed from mouth to mouth, each retelling more dramatic than the last. "I heard he was found right there in Dolly's summerhouse, just lying in a pool of blood," exclaimed Mrs. Wren, shaking her head so vigorously that her bonnet threatened to slip. "Terrible business, terrible," muttered Mr. Higgins, the postmaster, though he seemed more fascinated than distraught. "Who would think someone could commit such a thing in Little Whitcomb?" Miss Marple, who had arrived for a brief respite from the tension at Dolly's, listened quietly, perched in a corner with her knitting basket across her lap. Her eyes, sharp and observant, traced the subtle interactions between the villagers. She noted the involuntary twitch of Mrs. Wren's hand as she poured tea for herself, the slight hesitation of Mr. Higgins when asked if he had seen anything suspicious, and the anxious glances of young Eliza Trent, who, by her own admission, had witnessed Geoffrey Penhaligon's arrival at the summerhouse earlier that day. Even in a small village, people were prone to theories. Mrs. Wren leaned closer to a cluster of women, whispering about the possibility of an old feud resurfacing. "Didn't he have that argument with Mr. Larch last month? About the estate boundaries?" Her tone suggested certainty, though Miss Marple knew the reality was usually far murkier. Meanwhile, Mr. Higgins speculated on a different angle, one he deemed more pragmatic. Perhaps a robbery gone wrong? "But nothing seems taken." "Oh no, that won't do at all. Paulstone wasn't known to keep anything valuable at the summerhouse." The young women at the inn, meanwhile, preferred gossip of the theatrical variety. "Maybe it was Geoffrey," exclaimed one, eyes wide. "I mean a city man, mysterious, a stranger. He could have his reasons, can't he? The others nodded with dramatic flair, adding imagined scenarios involving secret inheritances, clandestine affairs, and long-hidden grudges. Miss Marple, however, paid attention to the quieter signals, the hesitation in speech, the tiny flickers of anxiety that betrayed secrets more reliably than words ever could. She noted, for example, that Mrs. Penhaligon, though outwardly composed, had a slight paleness that deepened whenever Geoffrey's name was mentioned. Dr. Harrow's usual calm seemed forced, as if concealing a private irritation, and Dolly Bantry herself, while gracious and sociable, clutched at the handles of her teacup in a manner that suggested both worry and a keen desire to manage appearances. By late afternoon, the news had travelled to the vicarage. Reverend Smythe, a man of gentle manners and considerable curiosity, had summoned his housekeeper, Mrs. Fenton, to discuss the implications of the murder for the parish. "We must pray for composure," he said solemnly, "and ensure that no one spreads unnecessary panic." But even as he spoke, he peered at his visitor's reactions, aware that fear, even mild, could reveal truths otherwise hidden. Across the village, the reactions were similar: anxiety mixed with fascination, sorrow mingled with speculation. Children whispered about ghosts in the snow, imagining spectral figures gliding through the silent streets. Shopkeepers exchanged knowing looks, careful to discuss the event without frightening customers. Even the post office, usually a hub of mundane transactions, buzzed with nervous energy. Letters and telegrams seemed to carry a weight heavier than mere words, as if the act itself had imbued them with a strange tension. Miss Marple, of course, attended to these reactions with her usual measured attention. She noted who avoided certain topics, who lingered on minor details unnecessarily, and who tried to assert dominance in conversation. Every gesture, every slip of the tongue, added to her growing picture of the village's hidden dynamics. A murder, she knew, was rarely an isolated act. It was entwined with human emotion, with jealousy, resentment, and long-buried grievances. By evening, the constable had arrived to begin his initial questioning. Constable Pritchard was a young man, eager but inexperienced, his eyes wide with the seriousness of the case. He gathered the villagers into the village hall, a modest space warmed by a single stove, and began taking statements. "You understand? Anyone with information, no matter how minor, must speak now," he urged. Voices rose in a chorus of overlapping accounts, each villager presenting their observations, filtered through fear, imagination, or a desire to appear relevant. Miss Marple, sitting quietly near a window, listened with a patience that belied the complexity of her thoughts. Her keen mind began sorting fact from embellishment, observing inconsistencies, and noting peculiar alignments of behavior. The footprints in the snow, the slight discoloration on a glove, the nervous repetition of certain words, all were catalogued silently. Dr. Harrow, summoned for medical insight, provided a calm and precise account. Mr. Paulston's injuries were consistent with a single determined attack. There was no sign of a struggle, suggesting he either knew his assailant or was taken entirely by surprise. While this statement provided clarity for some, Miss Marple considered what it implied about the psychological state of the murderer: confident, controlled, and familiar with human reaction. As the evening deepened, the village settled into a tense vigilance. Groups lingered near windows, watching the snow obscure familiar landmarks, each person assessing the other's movements and temperaments. The night brought with it a palpable sense of suspense, as though the very air held its breath, waiting for revelation or disruption. In a quiet corner, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes sweeping the gathered villagers. "People are seldom what they appear," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Her fingers traced the edge of her cup, a gentle motion that betrayed nothing. But within, her mind worked steadily, assembling pieces of a puzzle that, as yet, no one else could even begin to imagine. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake settling with perfect neutrality, indifferent to the human fears it covered. And inside the village hall, the murmur of speculation, the flicker of nerves, and the hidden truths whispered by subtle gestures formed the stage upon which Miss Marple's quiet genius would begin to unravel the tangled threads of murder in Little Whitcomb. The next morning, Little Whitcomb awoke to a thin, icy sunlight that glinted off the rooftops and turned the snow into a dazzling carpet. The serenity of the village belied the restless murmurings that had taken hold since the previous day. Miss Marple, ever alert to nuances invisible to most, left Dolly Bantry's cottage early, opting for a slow walk through the frost-bitten lanes toward the Summerhouse. She wished to observe the scene once more, before the police had fully cordoned it off. For human behavior, she knew, often revealed more than physical evidence. The Summerhouse stood quiet now, a somber reminder of the violent act that had occurred. Constable Pritchard, flustered but diligent, was busy taking notes and speaking. The first layer of suspicion had been laid, and the village, though outwardly composed, was rife with speculation, fear, and unspoken accusations. Miss Marple, ever patient and quietly perceptive, knew that the deeper truths were yet to emerge. In time she would trace them carefully, piece by piece, observing where deception faltered, and where the human heart left its unguarded marks. Even in the quiet of Dolly's sitting room, with snow drifting softly past the windows, Miss Marple's mind remained alert. The game of observation had only just begun, and the obvious suspect, she understood, might prove to be a convenient distraction. Patience, subtlety, and a careful eye for human nature would reveal what the police and villagers alike could not yet see. The morning was crisp, the snow glinting in soft patches of sunlight as Miss Marple made her way once more toward Dolly Bantry's garden. The events of the previous days had unsettled little Whitcomb, leaving the villagers whispering anxiously and avoiding direct conversation. Miss Marple, however, moved with her customary calm, her mind attuned to the subtlest shifts in human behavior and the quietest of overlooked details. The Summerhouse had been carefully preserved in its scene of disturbance, now under the watchful eye of Constable Pritchard, who hovered uneasily by the door. Inspector Cray had requested the presence of several villagers for further questioning, but the morning air carried a silence that suggested their reluctance. Miss Marple noticed at once the expressions of polite compliance masking hesitation, as if each visitor was stepping carefully to avoid revealing themselves too fully. Dolly Bantry greeted her at the gate, an uneasy smile flickering across her face. "Jane, I thought perhaps a walk in the garden would do us both some good," she said. "One feels trapped indoors with all this tension." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Observation often benefits from perspective. Dolly, a walk might reveal things unseen from within." As they approached the Summerhouse, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn not to the obvious traces of the crime, but to a faint disturbance in the snow near the side of the building. Tiny footprints, almost invisible, hinted at movement during the hours after the murder. She crouched slightly, tracing the path with her gloved fingers, noting the direction, depth, and spacing. The footprints did not match those of any of the regular villagers. They were smaller, lighter, and suggested a hurried approach rather than a leisurely stroll. Inside the Summerhouse, the air retained a faint scent of the tea that had been prepared the day before, mingling with the faint metallic tang left by the tragedy. Miss Marple's gaze travelled methodically over the scene. The chair Mr. Paulstone had occupied, the tipped tea tray, the faint smudges on the windowsill. Her mind catalogued each small anomaly, each detail that had been dismissed or overlooked by those focused solely on the obvious. A subtle movement caught her attention, a small fragment of paper peeking from beneath the rug near the French windows. Carefully she retrieved it, unfolding the delicate scrap. It was a corner of a letter torn hastily, with a few words legible. "Cannot continue. If discovered, trust no one." The fragment was incomplete, yet the handwriting suggested urgency, perhaps even fear. To most observers, it would have seemed trivial, a mere accident of disturbance during the commotion. To Miss Marple, it was a clue of considerable importance. Dolly, observing her, asked in a hushed voice, "Jane, do you think this has meaning?" Miss Marple's eyes did not leave the fragment. It is often the smallest hint that reveals the largest truth. Someone wanted this message hidden, or thought it would go unnoticed. And yet, it has not escaped our attention. Outside, the snow continued to glisten, its serene whiteness belying the tension within. Miss Marple noted the tracks leading away from the summerhouse, small imprints that indicated movement toward the garden shed, a place usually overlooked and left unlocked for convenience. She examined the door carefully, observing faint scratches along the latch, the subtle impression of someone having tested it recently. These signs, minute though they were, suggested that someone had entered or exited through this auxiliary route, likely to avoid detection by other villagers. Meanwhile, visitors continued to arrive, drawn by curiosity or concern, and Miss Marple observed their behavior with her customary attention to detail. Mrs. Wren entered, her expression teetering between horror and excitement, clutching a muff and speaking in hurried whispers to anyone who would listen. "I heard something about a letter," she exclaimed, though her eyes betrayed uncertainty. "It seems there may have been communication." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Geoffrey Penhaligon, who had arrived with the intention of offering his assistance once more. He appeared composed, though the faint tension in his shoulders and the restless flexing of his fingers betrayed his discomfort. He asked Dolly politely about the morning's plans, speaking in measured tones, but Miss Marple noted the subtle glance he cast toward the garden shed, an attention that suggested curiosity rather than indifference. Inspector Cray arrived shortly after, clipboard in hand, observing the small group with the authority of office. "We must be methodical," he said. "Every detail, no matter how minor, must be considered." He glanced at the fragment Miss Marple held, frowning. "Where did you find that?" "In a place most would overlook," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Beneath the rug near the French windows. A small fragment, yet it hints at larger events." The inspector studied her expression, seeing only the gentle composure typical of the village's wise observer. He made a note of the fragment, but seemed to underestimate its potential significance. Miss Marple, of course, expected this. Authorities, methodical and diligent, often prioritized tangible facts over subtle human signals. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple retraced the footprints outside, connecting them with the known movements of the villagers. There was a pattern. One set approached the shed, hesitated and returned. Another departed toward the main road, possibly unseen. The combination of the letter fragment, the disturbed snow and the subtle signs of forced or hurried entry suggested a hidden layer of planning. The murderer had taken care to manipulate appearances, to create a narrative that would mislead both villagers and police. Dolly Bantry, sensing Miss Marple's preoccupation, approached with a worried glance. "Jane, what do you think it all means? Could anyone have known?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "At present, we must consider all possibilities. The smallest detail, the fragment of a letter, the disturbance in the snow, may reveal more than any statement or confession. And we must watch human behavior closely, for it seldom lies." By mid-afternoon, the villagers had begun their routines, though each movement was tinged with suspicion. The shopkeeper, the postmaster, and several neighbors passed by, exchanging nervous greetings and furtive glances toward the summerhouse. Gossip traveled quickly, yet Miss Marple's attention remained focused on what could not be explained by hearsay. Footprints, fragments and fleeting gestures. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned to Dolly's sitting room, her mind active with connections invisible to the casual observer. The fragment of the letter lay on the table before her, a small yet telling clue. She considered the handwriting, the words chosen, and the urgency implied. Someone had attempted to communicate a secret, likely one that involved both fear and necessity, and the disposal or tearing of the letter suggested an effort to hide the truth from immediate detection. The day's quiet had been punctuated by observation and deduction, and Miss Marple recognized that the initial suspicion placed upon Geoffrey Penhaligon and the more obvious suspects might well be a diversion. The small overlooked clue, the fragment of the letter, had shifted her perspective. Patterns were emerging that required patience, careful observation, and above all, a steady understanding of human nature. As the fire in Dolly's hearth crackled, Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected upon the morning. The murder had revealed itself to be more than a simple act of violence. Layers of secrecy, subtle deception, and unspoken intentions were entwined in ways the villagers could scarcely imagine, and the fragment of the letter, though tiny and incomplete, had already begun to illuminate the invisible connections that might ultimately lead to the murderer. She set the scrap down carefully, eyes distant yet focused. The hidden clue had opened a door, and Miss Marple, patient as always, would follow it wherever it led, quietly observing the reactions, the hesitations, and the truths the villagers could not or would not conceal. The following morning brought a pale winter light, diffused through low-hanging clouds, lending a soft but sombre tone to Little Whitcomb. The village was quieter than usual, as though the snow itself absorbed whispers of speculation. Miss Marple, as always, rose early, her mind alert to the smallest details, and made her way to Dolly Bantry's sitting room, where she found her friend already fretting over the day ahead. "Jane, I cannot help but feel there is more beneath the surface," Dolly said, wringing her hands. "It is as though everyone is hiding something, though none dare speak openly." Miss Marple nodded gently. "People are seldom without secrets, Dolly, and often it is the very concealment that reveals the truth more than any statement." By mid-morning, the village hall was once again the center of activity. Inspector Cray had arranged further questioning, determined to untangle the threads of opportunity and motive. Villagers arrived in a hesitant stream, each bringing fragments of recollections, observations, or suspicions. Miss Marple remained unobtrusive, quietly observing interactions, noting inconsistencies, and cataloguing subtle signs of guilt, fear, or embarrassment. Mr. Larch was the first to be drawn into deeper scrutiny. The earlier account he had given was examined minutely, with Cray questioning him about every movement, every glance, and every word spoken during the time surrounding the murder. Miss Marple noticed that his eyes flicked nervously whenever Geoffrey Penhaligon was mentioned, and the slight flush on his cheeks suggested discomfort beyond mere polite concern. She made a mental note. Sometimes guilt was not direct, but association and unspoken tension could betray even a relatively innocent heart. Mrs. Penhaligon, despite her apparent composure, revealed subtle hints of a strained past with her nephew. In conversation with Dolly, she confessed, almost accidentally, to an incident years prior in London, in which Geoffrey had found himself in serious trouble, a secret long concealed. Her hesitation, the slight tremor in her voice, and the careful avoidance of certain words were all noted by Miss Marple. Secrets, she reflected, often had a way of shaping present actions. Meanwhile, Dr. Harrow continued to provide insight into the psychological implications of the murder. "The method of attack indicates deliberate calculation," he remarked to Inspector Cray. "The victim did not struggle," suggesting familiarity, or at least an attempt to lull him into trust. Miss Marple, listening quietly from her corner, observed the reactions of the villagers to this assessment. Some appeared relieved, others anxious, while a few, those with hidden grievances, stirred uneasily. The doctor's words, though neutral in tone, illuminated concealed motives more clearly than any accusation might. As the questioning continued, Dolly Bantry invited Miss Marple to join her in the kitchen for a brief respite. "Over tea," Dolly confided. "Jane, there is an old grievance between Mr. Paulstone and the Harrows, though it is seldom spoken of. It involved a small inheritance dispute years ago. People are polite, but resentments linger longer than one imagines." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. Every villager, every family, every historical dispute could provide the seeds for motive. She considered the landscape of past interactions and subtle tensions, noting that a seemingly innocuous quarrel could easily become the catalyst for violence. By early afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Summerhouse. Outside, the footprints in the snow had begun to blur, partially covered by fresh flakes. Inside, she examined the subtle disturbances left from the initial investigation: the tilted chair, the tea set slightly moved, and the faint smudge on the windowsill. Each detail, though minor, contributed to an understanding of movement, intention, and human response under stress. It was then that she observed Geoffrey Penhaligon in conversation with Mr. Larch, their tones low and guarded. Miss Marple noted how Geoffrey's hand briefly touched his coat pocket in a nervous gesture, and how Mr. Larch avoided eye contact, his fingers tapping against the side of the chair. Such small signals, she understood, often contained more truth than direct statements. Later, a small but telling revelation emerged from young Eliza Trent. While hesitant and shy, she admitted seeing a figure moving toward the garden shed during the hours surrounding the murder, an observation she had initially withheld out of fear of being disbelieved. Miss Marple quietly absorbed this, aligning it with the footprints she had traced earlier. The shed, usually overlooked, was becoming increasingly central to the unfolding picture. Villagers' past secrets began to surface more tangibly as the day progressed. Mrs. Wren, gossiping nervously with neighbours, mentioned a rumour of a quarrel between Mr. Paulstone and a former employee, long since dismissed under ambiguous circumstances. Another villager recalled Mr. Paulstone's strict management style, noting that several minor slights in the village had likely festered into resentment over time. Each fragment, however small or seemingly inconsequential, was a thread Miss Marple quietly wove into her understanding of human nature and motive. By evening, tensions were palpable. The villagers, aware of each other's reactions and aware that observation was occurring, moved carefully through the snow-laden streets. Miss Marple, seated near the fire in Dolly's sitting room, reflected on the day's revelations. Hidden resentments, subtle alliances, unspoken fears, all were visible in small gestures, pauses in speech and nervous glances. Dolly, watching her friend, commented, "Jane, it is as if everyone wears a mask, but one cannot help noticing cracks in the facade." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, her knitting needles moving methodically. "And it is often through those cracks that the truth emerges." As darkness fell, the village's quiet streets were punctuated by the occasional snow-laden footstep, each echo carrying a mix of fear, curiosity, and unspoken tension. Miss Marple understood that the day had revealed far more than outward observation could suggest. Each villager carried a secret, whether of past resentment, hidden fear, or subtle jealousy. And in the delicate interplay of these hidden truths lay the pathway to understanding the murder. She traced patterns in her mind, footprints aligned with sighted movements, fragments of overheard conversations with observed hesitations, the seemingly minor disputes of the past with gestures of unease in the present. Slowly, imperceptibly, the outlines of motive, opportunity, and subtle deception began to converge. Miss Marple, as ever, remained composed, knitting quietly by the fire. Yet her mind worked relentlessly, deciphering the invisible signals that the villagers could not conceal. The hidden layers of human behavior, carefully observed and patiently analyzed, would reveal what the obvious evidence had so far obscured. The first threads of understanding had been gathered, and she knew that patience, subtle questioning, and careful attention would eventually illuminate the full picture. As she sipped her tea, she reflected on human nature. People conceal what they fear to reveal, mislead to protect themselves, and often underestimate the perception of someone patient, quiet, and deeply attentive. Tomorrow would require more observation, more conversations, and perhaps gentle tests of character. But Miss Marple was confident. The secrets of little Whitcomb were beginning to show themselves, and the murderer's carefully constructed disguise was already beginning to falter under her steady, watchful eye. The following morning brought a sudden, sharp cold that made the village streets sparkle like frost-covered jewels. The tension in little Whitcomb, already taut, seemed to hum with new urgency. Miss Marple, as ever, moved quietly among the villagers, observing each interaction and noting every subtle twitch or hesitation, every glance that lingered too long or avoided direct eye contact. Early that day, a surprising and unsettling development disrupted the fragile equilibrium. A valuable piece of jewelry, long believed to be safely kept in the Bantry household, had disappeared. Dolly Bantry discovered it missing just as she prepared tea, the small, intricately set brooch, a family heirloom gone from its usual spot. The news spread like wildfire, instantly compounding the unease caused by Mr. Paulstone's murder. Inspector Cray arrived promptly, his expression a mixture of irritation and concern. "This complicates matters," he said, glancing at Miss Marple, who stood quietly nearby. "We now have not only a murder to consider, but also a theft, likely by someone within the household or someone who has been moving unseen." Miss Marple examined the scene carefully. The tray where the brooch had rested showed no obvious signs of disturbance, except for a faint indentation on the velvet lining, suggesting it had been removed with deliberate care. Nothing else in the room had been disturbed. She also noticed a slight smudge on the windowsill near the summerhouse, a subtle detail that had been overlooked in previous observations. The villagers reacted in predictable and unpredictable ways. Mrs. Wren, has ever, offered immediate speculation. It must be someone greedy, Jane. A thief. Perhaps one of Geoffrey's acquaintances from the city, she exclaimed, her voice carrying alarm and accusation in equal measure. Geoffrey Penhaligon, who had been visiting with Dolly to offer comfort, tensed slightly at the remark. Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in his expression, though it was not the same tension she had seen previously. This was defensive, not guilty, a subtle distinction but meaningful. Meanwhile, Mrs. Penhaligon appeared genuinely distressed, her hands trembling as she sought to assist Dolly in retracing steps and checking possible hiding places. Her behavior, though sympathetic, contained the faintest hint of hesitation whenever the topic of the brooch or Mr. Paulstone's previous affairs arose. Miss Marple catalogued this carefully. Young Eliza Trent, the observant child who had already provided insights about the movements in the garden, now offered a new observation. "I saw a shadow move past the side window early this morning," she said softly, her voice edged with fear. "I couldn't see who it was, but it seemed hurried, almost sneaky." Miss Marple considered this alongside the footprints she had noted previously. The pattern of movement was becoming clearer. Someone had taken advantage of both the chaos following the murder and the villagers' assumptions about obvious suspects to act unnoticed. The brooch's disappearance suggested planning and awareness of the investigation's trajectory. Inspector Cray, focusing on tangible evidence, quickly questioned everyone present in the house that morning. His methodical approach, though thorough, overlooked subtler behavioral cues that Miss Marple perceived immediately. The glances exchanged between Dolly Bantry and Geoffrey, the slight paleness on Mrs. Penhaligon's cheeks, and the nervous fidgeting of Mr. Larch, each suggested layers of concern, though not necessarily guilt. By mid-morning, the tension had escalated further. Rumors began circulating that the theft might somehow be linked to Mr. Paulstone's murder, a coincidence that seemed unlikely to Miss Marple. Yet she understood that perception, often more than reality, shaped the villagers' reactions. Fear and speculation were powerful forces, and the convergence of these two incidents created fertile ground for misdirection. Miss Marple spent time retracing paths from the Bantry drawing room to the Summerhouse. The snow outside bore traces of several different footprints, some leading toward the garden shed, others toward the village road. The impressions were faint, but sufficient for someone as meticulous as Miss Marple to follow. She noted the subtle overlaps, lighter prints crossing heavier ones, patterns of approach and retreat that suggested careful observation by whoever had moved unnoticed. Dolly Bantry fretted beside her. "Jane, do you think someone has been watching the house all this time? Could they have known when to act?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "People often know more than they admit, Dolly, and sometimes opportunity presents itself in ways that are entirely unplanned. The important detail is that whoever took the brooch acted with knowledge of movements, timing, and observation." The afternoon brought a new and unexpected witness, Mrs. Fenton, the vicar's housekeeper. She had been walking past the Bantry garden when she saw a figure crouching near the Summerhouse shed, holding something small and shiny. She did not recognize the person clearly, but her description, a slim figure, careful movements, hesitant posture, added a crucial layer to the developing picture. Miss Marple listened carefully, noting how Mrs. Fenton's recollection, though partial, aligned with other subtle observations she had already made. Meanwhile, Geoffrey Penhaligon suggested searching the village for the missing brooch, but his offer, though helpful, carried an undertone of insistence that seemed slightly defensive. Miss Marple, perceptive as always, filed away every inflection, every hesitation, and every gesture. These human subtleties, she knew, often revealed far more than physical evidence. Inspector Cray, while frustrated by the dual incidents, maintained procedural rigor, questioning villagers and reviewing possible access points. Yet each line of inquiry seemed to circle back to what Miss Marple had been observing quietly for days, patterns of human behavior, rather than mere chance or simple opportunity, were central to understanding the events. As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat in Dolly's sitting room, knitting and reviewing the day's subtle revelations. The brooch's disappearance, she realized, was not merely an act of theft. It was a distraction, designed to redirect suspicion and manipulate perception. The footprints, the shadow observed by Eliza, the partial recognition by Mrs. Fenton, all pointed to careful orchestration. Someone intended the villagers to focus on obvious suspects while concealing the true trajectory of events. Miss Marple understood that the pattern of human behavior, the gestures, hesitations and interactions, was the key to unraveling both the murder and the theft. Patience, observation, and a delicate understanding of motive would in time reveal the truth. And as the evening deepened, the village settled into a tense, watchful silence. The snow reflected the dim glow of lanterns, streets emptying as villagers whispered among themselves. Miss Marple, ever composed, reflected on the complexity of human nature. Deception, fear and self-interest intertwined with loyalty, fear of shame and protective instincts. The unexpected theft had introduced a new layer of complication, yet it also offered insight. Miss Marple, quietly knitting by the fire, recognized that the patterns were aligning, that human behavior, subtle, revealing, and consistent, would ultimately illuminate the path to the perpetrator. The twists she knew were only beginning to unveil themselves, and the threads of truth were waiting to be followed with patience, care and attention to detail. The morning dawned clear and bitter, frost glinting on every branch and blade of grass. Little Whitcomb was unusually silent, the villagers moving with a cautious, watchful air, as though aware that the next moments could bring revelation or further unease. Miss Marple, with her usual composure, rose early, her mind already assembling connections, noting subtle gestures and small inconsistencies that others failed to see. She arrived at Dolly Bantry's cottage mid-morning, finding her friend arranging tea with anxious precision. Dolly's hands trembled slightly, betraying her attempt at calm, and her eyes were bright with worry. "Jane, I feel that today may bring answers," she said softly, glancing toward the door. Miss Marple nodded gently. Patience and careful observation will often reveal what hasty speculation cannot. The plan, as it had formed quietly in Miss Marple's mind over the past days, was simple yet delicate. She would engage the villagers, especially those whose behavior had struck her as unusual, and observe their reactions to subtle prompts. A psychological test, gentle yet revealing, would show who harbored secrets and who merely worried on behalf of others. Her first visit was to the Bantry Summerhouse, where Inspector Cray and Constable Pritchard were coordinating the day's inquiries. Miss Marple spoke politely with Geoffrey Penhaligon, asking innocuous questions about his movements, about minor details of the household, and about his thoughts on the recent theft of the brooch. Geoffrey answered with measured politeness, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted a slight tightening of his lips, the subtle lift of an eyebrow, and the fraction of a second hesitation before mentioning the garden shed. Next, she quietly spoke with Mr. Larch, who had earlier been a focus of suspicion. "I wonder," she said softly, "about the little corners people frequent without thinking. The shed, for example, is often overlooked. Yet many small things find their way there." Mr. Larch's hand twitched, as though in response, and he avoided her gaze, brushing aside the comment with a hurried explanation about tending to his own property. Miss Marple filed away the reaction, noting both defensiveness and subtle anxiety. By mid-morning, villagers had gathered at the Bantry cottage, ostensibly to offer assistance, but also to exchange guarded opinions. Miss Marple observed carefully, initiating casual conversation that hinted at knowledge of the Summerhouse's layout, the snow tracks, and the letter fragment found days earlier. She spoke with a calm, neutral tone, allowing curiosity and fear to elicit natural responses. She asked Dolly, almost in passing, about the brooch. "A curious thing, isn't it, that such a small object might stir such attention? One wonders who might have felt it necessary to remove it." Dolly, surprised by the question, hesitated slightly before answering, her uncertainty revealing concern but not guilt. When Geoffrey responded, however, Miss Marple noted that his eyes flickered toward the drawing-room window, and his hand unconsciously clenched the edge of the table. A fleeting flush colored his cheeks, though his voice remained calm. Miss Marple, observing, did not question him directly, but allowed these reactions to accumulate as part of her psychological puzzle. Later, she spoke with Mrs. Penhaligon, gently inquiring about her recollection of Mr. Paulstone's manner in the weeks before his death. Mrs. Penhaligon's answers were careful, yet a slight tightening of the throat and a faint tremor in her hands suggested anxiety. Miss Marple recognized the signs. Those who bore secrets often revealed them unconsciously through micro-expressions. Miss Marple also subtly observed interactions between villagers, noting who lingered near whom, who exchanged glances that hinted at shared knowledge or silent warning. The patterns were small but telling. A whispered comment, a fleeting exchange of eyes, a sudden shift in posture. Each gave insight into the relationships, tensions, and hidden motives surrounding the murder and theft. By afternoon, she initiated a seemingly casual discussion about the sequence of events leading to Mr. Paulstone's death. "One wonders how people managed to move unnoticed despite the fresh snow," she said lightly. "Sometimes the smallest clue, footprints, a misplaced object, can reveal more than the loudest accusations." The reaction was immediate yet subtle. Geoffrey shifted in his chair, clearing his throat before responding, while Mr. Larch's hand brushed against the table edge with a sharp tap, a gesture he quickly masked. Miss Marple noted the exact timing and quality of these micro-reactions, understanding that guilt, anxiety, or knowledge often betrayed themselves in ways too small for the unobservant to detect. Miss Marple then directed her attention toward the Bantry garden, suggesting a walk to review the snow tracks. "The snow is honest," she said softly. "It does not lie. Yet it can be misleading if one is unaware of the patterns people leave behind." The villagers followed, curiosity tempered by wariness. As they examined the tracks, Miss Marple made small, casual comments about various imprints, deliberately emphasizing certain areas while ignoring others. The responses were telling. A tightened jaw here, a sidelong glance there, a hand brushed nervously across a coat pocket. Even the quietest participant revealed more than words could convey. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had accumulated a wealth of observations. The subtle tests had confirmed her earlier impressions. Certain villagers' behaviors aligned with deception, while others' reactions suggested innocence, anxiety, or misplaced concern. She recognized that the path to understanding was not through confrontation nor accusation, but through the careful reading of human nature itself. Returning indoors, she reflected on the day. The small orchestrated prompts had served their purpose. The guilty could not entirely conceal themselves, while the innocent remained largely transparent. Miss Marple understood that patience and observation were more revealing than any direct interrogation. Dolly, sensing the quiet intensity of her friend, asked softly, "Jane, do you know who it might be?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting needles moving rhythmically. "Patience, my dear. The next steps will confirm what observation alone has suggested. One must wait for the human heart to reveal itself fully." As the evening settled over Little Whitcomb, the villagers moved cautiously through the streets, their minds uneasy and speculation rampant. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, reviewed her meticulous mental notes, gestures, pauses, reactions, and shifts in posture. The test had been subtle, indirect, yet profoundly revealing. She knew that the final pieces were falling into place. The human behaviors she had observed, the micro-expressions, the subtle evasions, and the involuntary admissions, all were converging toward the truth. Patience and careful analysis had brought her closer than ever to the solution, and she felt confident that the next moments of revelation would confirm what she had already discerned. The quiet village, dusted in snow, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple, calm, attentive, and watchful, understood that the final confrontation with the truth was imminent, and that human nature itself would provide the answers long before any direct accusation could be made. The morning sun filtered weakly through the frost-coated windows of Little Whitcomb, casting long pale shadows across the village streets. The snow, crisp and undisturbed in places, reflected the calm before the inevitable storm of revelation. Miss Marple moved quietly through the Bantry garden, her eyes tracing familiar paths, her mind assembling the intricate web of observation and deduction she had been cultivating for days. She entered the sitting room, where Dolly Bantry awaited, a quiet tension in her posture. "Jane," Dolly said softly, "today feels different. There is a sense of conclusion in the air, though we know not what it will be." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but focused. "Patience, Dolly. The truth often requires that we allow events to align themselves. The final pieces will fall naturally into place. Inspector Cray arrived shortly after, his manner brisk, clipboard in hand, yet showing a hint of curiosity regarding Miss Marple's composed demeanour. The villagers were summoned, each arriving under polite pretences, but all aware to varying degrees that the day might bring closure or further tension. Miss Marple began with small observations, commenting on the snow tracks in the garden, the footprints leading to the summerhouse, and the disturbances in the snow near the shed. Her tone was light, casual, yet every word was chosen to elicit the smallest reaction from those present. Subtle shifts in posture, involuntary gestures, and fleeting expressions were all observed with meticulous care. She addressed the room with gentle precision. It is curious, is it not, how certain movements leave traces, and how even a small object, a brooch perhaps, can change the perceptions of those around us. People notice differently, and often the truth is revealed not in loud declarations, but in the quietest reactions. Geoffrey Penhaligon, standing near the drawing-room window, shifted slightly, a faint blush colouring his cheeks. Mr. Larch fidgeted with the edge of his coat, and Mrs. Penhaligon's hands tightened over a folded handkerchief. Miss Marple observed each micro-expression carefully, cataloguing them in her mind. With deliberate calm, she introduced the final test of human behaviour. We have been discussing the summerhouse, the garden, and the paths people took. Yet one cannot ignore the subtle signs left behind. Footprints, fragments of letters, small disturbances. They all tell a story if one knows how to read it. A pause followed. The villagers, uncertain, exchanged glances, caught in the quiet tension of anticipation. Miss Marple's eyes rested momentarily on the one person whose reactions had consistently diverged from the rest. The person who had reacted with carefully masked anxiety, whose gestures betrayed knowledge beyond ordinary concern. Consider, she continued softly, the fragment of the letter found beneath the rug. Its urgency, its partial concealment, suggested someone wished to hide knowledge, yet its discovery has brought us clarity. Human nature, in all its guile and instinct, often leaves traces where one hopes none remain. Miss Marple then turned her attention to the subtle patterns she had observed over days, the footprints leading from the summerhouse to the shed, the reactions to casual comments, the nervous glances, and the fleeting physical cues, tightened hands, rapid blinking, slight flushing of cheeks. "Mr. Larch," she said gently, yet with unmistakable certainty, "you were seen moving near the shed in the hours following Mr. Paulstone's death. Your actions, while seemingly harmless, correspond with the subtle disruptions in the snow and the movements of the missing brooch. You attempted to misdirect attention by allowing suspicion to fall upon others, yet the smallest signs betrayed you." Mr. Larch's face paled, his fingers clenching involuntarily. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, though his eyes avoided Miss Marple's gaze. "Human nature is a careful storyteller, Mr. Larch," Miss Marple replied. "Even when words fail, the body speaks. The footprints, the handling of objects, the hesitation and the anxiety. They have all told us what your explanations could not. You removed the brooch and manipulated movements to create suspicion elsewhere, and you took deliberate steps to conceal your actions following the murder. All these signs were subtle, yet unmistakable to a patient observer." Dolly Bantry gasped softly, clutching her shawl while Geoffrey Penhaligon remained motionless, his expression a mixture of relief and residual tension. Mr. Larch, confronted, shifted uncomfortably, finally lowering his gaze. The faint trace of guilt was visible in every movement, every quivering gesture. Miss Marple continued with quiet precision, detailing the sequence of events as she had reconstructed them. The initial opportunity, the use of the shed to move unseen, the removal of the brooch to misdirect suspicion, and the careful orchestration of reactions intended to manipulate perception. Each step aligned with her observations and the minor but telling evidence she had accumulated. "You see, Mr. Larch," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "it is rarely the loudest actions or the most obvious explanations that reveal the truth. Instead, it is the smallest signs, the imperceptible details of human behavior that expose deception. And when patience, observation, and understanding are applied, the truth emerges inevitably." Inspector Cray, having listened intently, stepped forward. "Mr. Larch, I believe Miss Marple has provided a clear account of the evidence. Your actions have been traced, and the logic of events combined with her observations confirms your guilt." A hush fell over the room, Mr. Larch, realizing that further denial would be futile, slumped into the nearest chair. His features betrayed defeat, and the carefully constructed facade he had maintained for days crumbled under the quiet authority of Miss Marple's insight. Miss Marple, seated calmly, allowed a moment of silence before speaking again. It is a human tendency to conceal what we fear will be judged. Yet in our very concealment we reveal more than we intend. The footprints, the fragment of the letter, the micro-reactions, all these spoke clearly to those who knew how to read them. The villagers, though relieved that the mystery was resolved, also carried an air of awe at the subtlety and precision of Miss Marple's deduction. The small village, usually concerned with minor gossip and routine, had been reminded of the depths and complexities of human nature, and of the quiet genius of one who observed patiently, subtly and without judgment. By evening, little Whitcomb had regained a measure of calm. The brooch was recovered, Mr. Larch was taken into custody, and the village began to settle back into its routine. Yet the memory of the careful orchestration, the hidden motives, and the understated brilliance of Miss Marple's insight lingered. Miss Marple, sitting by the fire in Dolly Bantry's sitting room, reflected on the events of the past days. Human nature, she knew, was intricate, often self-deceptive and layered with both fear and intention. Observation, patience, and understanding were the keys to unraveling even the most carefully concealed truths. And as the firelight flickered across her calm face, she allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The threads of human behavior had been followed to their inevitable conclusion, revealing what mere appearances could never disclose. The village of Little Whitcomb gradually settled into a calm that was almost serene, the tension of recent events slowly dissolving like frost under the gentle warmth of the winter sun. Villagers resumed their routines, shoveling snow from pathways, tending to their gardens, and exchanging cautious greetings, though a lingering awareness of recent revelations colored every interaction. Dolly Bantry, having recovered her family heirloom and witnessed the resolution of the murder, moved with a lightened step through her home. The Summerhouse, once a place of fear and tragedy, now seemed almost ordinary, though faint traces of disruption, subtle dents in the floorboards, minor scuffs on the walls, remained as reminders of what had transpired. Miss Marple observed quietly, sitting by the window with her knitting resting on her lap. She watched as children played briefly in the snow, their laughter punctuating the crisp air, and as villagers exchanged warm smiles, tentative yet genuine. Yet beneath the surface, the patterns of human nature, which had been so carefully revealed, remained as instructive and compelling as ever. Inspector Cray, having completed the necessary documentation and formalities, took his leave, satisfied that justice had been achieved. He offered Miss Marple a courteous nod, acknowledging her role in unveiling what his own methods had struggled to expose. Miss Marple responded with a gentle smile, her attention already returning to the subtle observations of the village around her. Geoffrey Penhaligon, now relieved of suspicion, expressed his gratitude to both Dolly and Miss Marple. "I cannot imagine how you saw what none of us could," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. Miss Marple, as ever, deflected attention with characteristic modesty. "Observation and patience often reveal truths that are hidden in plain sight," she replied softly. Throughout the day, Miss Marple moved among the villagers, offering gentle conversation and calm reassurance. She listened to recountings of recent experiences, noting the varied interpretations and emotional responses. Even in casual remarks, she discerned the echoes of fear, curiosity, and relief, elements that had shaped the unfolding of events more profoundly than any overt action. The Bantry household prepared for a modest afternoon gathering, a gesture toward normalcy and community. Tea was served, and conversation turned to topics of local concern, gardening, and village news, unrelated to the recent disturbances. Miss Marple, while participating lightly, remained ever observant, her mind reflecting on human behavior in its many manifestations. She considered the layers of secrecy, the hidden resentments, and the subtle manipulations that had driven Mr. Polston's murder and the theft of the brooch. It was remarkable, she thought, how ordinary human emotions, envy, fear, ambition, and the desire for self-preservation, could be woven into a pattern so intricate that it nearly evaded discovery. Yet patience, subtlety, and careful attention to detail had unveiled the truth. As evening approached, the village streets were quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of lamplight reflecting off the snow. Villagers returned to their homes, closing doors against the chill and settling into domestic routines. Yet, the awareness that human nature could conceal as much as it revealed lingered subtly in the back of minds. Miss Marple and Dolly sat together in the warm glow of the sitting-room fire. Dolly sighed, a mixture of relief and reflection in her tone. "Jane, it is astonishing how much went unseen even under careful observation. I cannot imagine how anyone could have pieced it all together so perfectly." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "It is rarely the obvious that reveals itself first, Dolly. The small gestures, the fleeting expressions, and the patterns of behavior often speak more clearly than words or appearances. Human nature has its own language, and once you learn to read it, the truth is never far." She leaned back slightly, considering the village around her, the lives intertwined in subtle complexity, and the quiet resilience of ordinary people. Even after the turmoil, Little Whitcomb had returned to its peaceful routine, yet with a newfound awareness of the delicate balances underlying daily life. The snow, now softening under the late afternoon sun, seemed to symbolize the settling of tensions, the quiet covering of past disturbances, and the continuity of life. Miss Marple, knitting slowly, reflected on the patterns she had observed, the motivations she had discerned, and the intricate dance of human behavior that had led to both crime and its resolution. In her mind, she catalogued the lessons once more: the danger of assumption, the significance of patience, the importance of subtle observation, and the persistent truth that human nature, in all its complexity, could be understood if one was willing to watch carefully and think deeply. The day drew to a close, and the village embraced the comfort of evening. Miss Marple, calm and composed, allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, yet the true marvel remained the intricate, often unseen ways that people interacted, concealed, and revealed themselves. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked out the window at the snow-covered village. Fair serene peace had returned, yet she knew, as always, that human nature held infinite subtleties waiting to be observed, lessons yet to be learned, and mysteries yet to be uncovered. The village of Little Whitcomb slept quietly, but for one quiet observer, the world remained a field rich with insight, observation, and understanding.